May 4th, 1945.
Its pilot is part of a new force.
Off the Sakishima Islands southwest of Okinawa, the sea looked deceptively ordinary. Low cloud, a hard wind, and a carrier deck that had already launched and recovered aircraft for hours. Task Force 57 of the British Pacific Fleet was there for a single purpose: to keep Japanese airfields suppressed so fewer attackers could reach the invasion armada at Okinawa. From March 26th into early April, the force had been hammering the Sakishima airfields. On April 23rd, it withdrew to San Pedro Bay to refuel and restock, then returned to operations on May 1st. Just after midday, routine snapped into catastrophe. A Japanese suicide aircraft broke through the defensive screen and drove itself into HMS Formidable carrying a bomb, hurling fire and wreckage across the flight deck, and the aircraft parked and refueling on it. Men were killed and wounded, aircraft were destroyed, and the forward island was scorched. Imperial War Museum's photographs from the Sakishima operations show firefighters working through foam and smoke on Formidable's deck after a Japanese suicide plane crash on the flight deck while supporting the Okinawa landings. But Formidable did not become a floating furnace. The armored flight deck took the blow at the surface, limiting the kind of deep, hangar-level damage that could trap fire, smoke, and aviation fuel below and halt flying for days. Damage control parties smothered flames, cleared wreckage, and patched the dent so aircraft operations could resume later the same day. That resilience was not luck. It was design, rooted in a British assumption forged earlier in the war. A carrier might have to fight under land-based air power, close to hostile coasts, where attackers could arrive in numbers and with little warning. The illustrious type approach placed armor at flight deck level and built an armored box around the hangar, trading some aircraft capacity for survivability and continuity of operations. Okinawa turned kamikaze warfare into an industrial problem. U.S. ships carried the main weight, and many had to withdraw after severe damage. U.S. Navy historical writing notes that Task Force 57's continued availability helped compensate for damaged American carriers, and campaign summaries emphasized that the Royal Navy's armored decks usually meant only brief interruptions even after significant strikes. Formidable's burning deck on May 4th was only the opening test. Over the next days, more attackers would come in low and fast, and the story would be measured in minutes. How quickly a scarred flight deck could become a runway again, and what that meant for the wider battle off Okinawa. Yet the strike on May 4th was not the end of the test. It was the opening proof that the British carriers could absorb a kamikaze blow and still keep their mission intact. Task Force 57 was not hunting a single decisive fleet action. It was executing Operation Iceberg in its hardest form, returning to the Sakishima Islands day after day to suppress the airfields that could stage suicide attacks toward Okinawa, because every runway left usable increased the pressure on the invasion fleet. On HMS Formidable, that tempo turned damage control into a discipline as important as flying. The May 4th hit killed 8 men and wounded 47, tore a deep gouge into the armored flight deck near the island, and scattered burning wreckage among aircraft parked on deck. What mattered next was how the ship's design and her crew's procedures worked together. Flames smothered, aviation fuel hazards contained, wreckage hauled clear, and the damaged patch made serviceable again within hours using rapid fill and plating techniques described by Fleet Air Arm sources. The Japanese tested that claim almost immediately. On May 9th, another wave reached the fleet and a second suicide aircraft struck Formidable. The ship's action damage report and later summaries emphasize how quickly the response had become reflexive. Fires brought under control in about 15 minutes and flight deck operations resumed roughly 35 minutes after impact, with aircraft already returning from strikes and being turned around for the next launch cycle. And Formidable was not alone. In the same attacks on May 9th, a kamikaze also crashed onto HMS Victoria's flight deck, damaging topside equipment and briefly interrupting operations. A U.S. Naval Institute history of the British Pacific Fleet describes how rapidly British flight operations could resume after such hits, and why that mattered as American carriers suffered heavier damage and rotated out for repair. This is the contrast that sits under your title. American fleet carriers generally carried larger air groups, but severe deck and hangar damage could mean longer interruptions and, at times, withdrawal for repair. British armored flight decks reduced the chance that a single hit would trigger a deep hangar-level disaster that stopped flying altogether. By early May 1945, that resilience had made Task Force 57 a dependable strike engine under kamikaze pressure, and it leads directly to the deeper question: what exactly did Britain trade away to build carriers that could keep operating under direct impact? The British Pacific Fleet did not operate its armored carriers off Okinawa by chance. These ships, forged through the attrition of earlier theaters and doctrinal choices made long before the Pacific Campaign, brought with them a defensive philosophy that would be tested under some of the fiercest kamikaze attacks of the war. By 1945, carriers like HMS Victorious, HMS Indefatigable, and HMS Indomitable had already endured years of service and multiple engagements across the globe. In the Mediterranean, in the Indian Ocean, and in the earlier sweep toward the Japanese home islands, their armor schemes and layered anti-aircraft batteries had been honed against bombers and torpedo attacks. When Task Force 57 steamed back toward Okinawa for Operation Iceberg, it carried not just aircraft, but a cumulative lesson in survival. On this stage of the Pacific War, British carriers faced an enemy that had already adapted its strategy to the overwhelming seaborne power arrayed against Japan. Kamikaze tactics emerged from the desperation of Japan's shrinking air reserves. Specially trained pilots flying explosive-laden planes directly into Allied ships to maximize damage and psychological shock. In the space of Operation Iceberg, the massive Allied offensive aimed at capturing Okinawa and opening the gateway to Japan's home islands. More than 1,000 such attacks were launched against ships of the Fifth Fleet and its supporting forces. It was a relentless gauntlet that sank destroyers and crippled battleships, and it tested every defensive measure the Allies could muster. Despite that onslaught, the British carriers repeatedly demonstrated a resilience that visibly contrasted with many American fleet carriers. The fundamental reason lay in their construction. Unlike U.S. carriers whose flight decks were largely unarmored and vulnerable to penetration, British carriers were designed with thick steel armor integrated into the deck and around vital sections of the hangar spaces below. This armor was capable of resisting bomb blasts and suicide plane impacts that would otherwise penetrate to the more fragile inner workings of the ship. It was a deliberate trade-off in naval architecture, accepting a reduced aircraft capacity in exchange for passive survivability under direct attack. HMS Indefatigable, for example, became the first British carrier in the Okinawa campaign to be struck by a kamikaze on April 1, 1945. The Japanese plane evaded the combat air patrols and hit the ship near the base of her island superstructure. The bomb it carried failed to detonate, and the armor and structure limited the damage sufficiently for flight operations to resume within half an hour. Casualties were serious, 21 killed and 27 wounded, but the ship remained in the fight, her deck once more launching aircraft in support of the suppression of Japanese airfields. This pattern repeated across the armored carriers. When HMS Victorious was struck on both the 4th and the 9th of May, the armored deck and underlying protective systems prevented catastrophic damage. Though equipment such as aircraft lifts and steam lines were affected, flying operations resumed within hours. Casualties were comparatively modest, and the ship continued its mission without the long repairs that afflict many other vessels after a kamikaze strike. Even HMS Indomitable, whose earlier Mediterranean service had left her with underlying machinery issues, fared better than many might have expected. On May 4, 1945, she was hit, and while the armor limited the worst effects, the engagement highlighted both the strengths and vulnerabilities inherent in prolonged combat service. The broader consequence was more than localized ship survival. The British carriers, because they could absorb and recover from kamikaze impacts with remarkable rapidity, contributed a continuity of strike capability to the Allied fleet that larger carriers sometimes could not sustain. In a campaign where air threats came not as isolated threats but in waves, that operational endurance became a strategic edge. Even before the smoke from the early May kamikaze strikes had fully cleared, another layer of context was already shaping the British Pacific Fleet's roll off Okinawa. Task Force 57, the naval formation that brought Britain's armored carriers into the Pacific War, was not simply an ad hoc addition to the U.S. Fifth Fleet. It was the culmination of strategic decisions that reached back to late 1944, when the Royal Navy reorganized its Eastern Fleet into a true Pacific strike force capable of operating thousands of miles from home bases, with its own carriers, cruisers, destroyers, and logistical support. From its formation at Trincomalee on November 22, 1944, the fleet trained, refitted, and sailed west to Sydney, where it became the forward naval base for offensive operations against Japanese airfields and supply centers. This was a genuinely multinational armada, trained from British, Australian, Canadian, and New Zealand navies. Task Force 57 operated alongside the United States Fifth Fleet, but retained unique British doctrine and equipment. Among the most obvious distinctions were the defensive philosophies embodied in the carriers themselves. While American Essex-class carriers emphasized large air wings to project power across vast distances of the Pacific, British carriers like Formidable, Victorious, Indefatigable, and the aging Illustrious were conceived before the Pacific War under treaty constraints that limited tonnage. Their answering feature was not more offensive aircraft but armor, especially armored flight decks designed to absorb incoming blows without allowing catastrophic penetration into vulnerable hangar spaces below. During Operation Iceberg, the code name for the Okinawa campaign, this doctrinal edge was repeatedly tested. Kamikaze attacks off the Sakishima Islands and the main Okinawa battle did not limit themselves to U.S. formations. British carriers were struck multiple times. Victorious was hit on the 4th and the 9th of May, yet her armored flight deck resisted the worst of the impacts, allowing flying operations to resume within hours despite damage to aircraft lifts and steam piping. Casualties were comparatively low, 3 men killed and 19 wounded during these hits, and the ship continued its assigned role in neutralizing enemy airbases rather than withdrawing for extensive repair. Indefatigable's experience on April 1st provides an even clearer demonstration of the difference that British design could make. A kamikaze aircraft evaded combat air patrols and struck near the island superstructure of the carrier. Crucially, the bomb it carried failed to detonate, but even with the explosive intact, the armored deck's capacity to absorb such a blow meant that, once smoke and debris were cleared, flight operations resumed within 30 minutes. Casualties were significant, 21 killed and 27 wounded, but the ship remained in action supporting the strike force and contributed to further operations against Japanese airfields. Across the British Pacific Fleet's carriers, a similar pattern of attack and rapid recovery played out. On May 9th, Formidable absorbed another hit from a kamikaze, depressing her flight deck armor and spilling fuel, yet fire teams extinguished blazes within 15 minutes and flying operations resumed about 35 minutes later. These swift recoveries mattered because Task Force 57's contribution was measured not only in ships preserved but in sustained offensive sorties against airfields that launched kamikazes in the first place. Allowing those bases to continue functioning unmolested would only have increased the toll on the wider Allied fleet, particularly the U.S. carriers with less inherent deck protection. By the middle of May 1945, even as Japanese suicidal attacks increased in volume and ferocity under the wider Operation Kikusui, British armored carriers continued to demonstrate an ability to absorb punishment and stay ready. The tactical payoff of their doctrinal design was clear. When most Allied carriers were expected to retire for repairs after severe deck damage, British armored carriers frequently resumed operations within the same day, limiting strategic disruption in a campaign where every sortie, every flight cycle, and every available aircraft made a difference. In the deadly calculus of Okinawa, that resilience proved a quietly defining contribution to Allied sea power, one rooted not in the biggest air wing, but in the capacity to keep flying no matter how many times the kamikaze struck. Put nearer to Japan, the British carriers learned that survival off Okinawa was measured less by heroics than by minutes. How fast a burning flight deck could become a runway again. Photographs from the Imperial War Museums show HMS Formidable's deck smothered in foam and water after a suicide aircraft struck during the Sakishima operations. Yet the ship's flying effort did not end there. In a later May strike, accounts record fires extinguished within about 15 minutes, and flight deck operations resumed about 35 minutes later. That difference mattered because Task Force 57's job was suppression. Hit the airfields feeding the kamikaze stream, then return and do it again the next day. U.S. Navy campaign histories note the British carrier force operating with the American fleet and striking those Japanese bases as part of the wider effort to blunt the air threat around Okinawa. In the end, that is the quiet lesson. Britain accepted fewer aircraft in exchange for carriers built to keep operating under direct attack, and in a battle of exhaustion, continuity became power. If you found this valuable, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments which Okinawa episode you want next.